Okay, I think we're going to begin. Welcome everyone on this bright Friday afternoon. My name is Shahzad Bashir. I'm a professor in history and religious studies, and it's my pleasure to just be kind of the moderator of this event. So we have one presenter and then two responses, and this is a book Adda, so it's a talk about a recent book. So I'm just going to introduce the author. He will talk for a while, and then we will have the responses and then an open conversation. So our guest of honor today is Professor SherAli Tareen, who is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions in the early modern and modern periods. His first book was entitled Defending Muhammad in Modernity, published by the University of Notre Dame Press in 2020. This is a book that won the prize for the best book in Pakistan studies and was also shortlisted for a prize from the American Academy of Religion. And now today, what we are going to hear about is his second book, recently published, called Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire, published by Columbia University Press. So welcome, SherAli.
Thank you so much, Shahzad. I want to begin by thanking Suvaid for organizing this talk and for inviting me and for all the time that he's put into meticulously planning this event. I want to thank Pawan and Natalia for their logistical support, all faculty at the Saxena Center, especially Wazira for her time and hospitality, Shahzad for sparing his time and moderating the session, and for that wonderful introduction, and to Supriya for not only being a critical intellectual interlocutor for this book, but on top of that, for extensive time in reading and commenting on the book as well. I'm really, really honored by your time and contribution. And thank you all for the gift of your time. It is an absolute honor and pleasure to be with you today. Before I get to my talk, especially since this is my first time visiting Brown, and I was particularly looking forward to this particular talk, because I just want to begin by registering my profound admiration and respect for the 19 Brown undergraduate students who participated in the hunger strike in solidarity with Palestine. In these dark and difficult times, these are the stories of courage and moral fortitude that keeps one going. And may such examples of courage multiply across campuses. So Suvaid asked me to speak for around 35 minutes, and I prepared a text. But before I get to my text, maybe I'll just take a couple of minutes in talking about the main theme and argument of the book, and maybe one good way to do that is by sharing with you a bit about the idea behind the title of the book, Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. So basically this book is about intra-Muslim scholarly debates on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim relations and friendship from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. And the main sort of idea that I'm working with in relation to the question of friendship, or the main argument that I try to make in the book, is that these intra-Muslim debates on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship were reflective of competing conceptions of the limits of Islam in conditions of political precarity, in conditions of early modern and then colonial South Asia. And with the category of friendship, I have in mind putting into conversation particular meditations on friendship in Western philosophical thought with Islamic intellectual history. So in Western philosophy, right from Aristotle all the way to someone more contemporary like Derrida, we see friendship being talked about as a concept and as a category which, as one scholar puts it, Alexander Nehamas, who's written an intellectual history of this concept in Western philosophical thought, presenting a double face, meaning friendship being a relationship that promises the highest forms of virtue, but can also morally corrupt someone blindingly bound to a harmful friend. So this idea of friendship as both a promise as well as a peril. So someone like Derrida talking about friendship always being marked by the shadows of the wound of enmity, as he calls it, or in Politics of Friendship. Or in another essay of his, cryptically titled, but I think productively titled, Hospitality, he talks about ways in which hostility and hospitality share a troubling common origin in terms of hostis as host or hostis as that who is hostile to you. So, in this book, I'm primarily interested in ways in which the promise and peril of Hindu-Muslim friendship gets debated by competing groups and groups of Muslim scholars and also individual Muslim scholars from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. And if you look at this category in Muslim intellectual thought, the category corresponding to the idea of friendship that I work with most frequently in this book is this category called muwalat in Arabic, which comes from the Arabic roots waliya, from which we get terms like wali or friend of God or Sufi master. And this category of muwalat and its connected terms like wilaya, walaya, which usually is translated as sainthood, it also has this kind of a dual etymology that on the one hand, it represents proximity, intimacy, closeness, but this idea can also mean sovereignty, sovereign power, sovereign ownership. So, for example, God talks about himself also in the second chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, as the wali of the faithful, the guardian of the faithful. So, given this kind of close linguistic and conceptual intimacy between the ideas of friendship and sovereignty, the main conceptual theme of this book is this friction and relationship between friendship and sovereignty. And there, the main idea I have in mind is that friendship as a relationship which entangles the self with the contingencies of the other, any relationship of intimacy, collaboration, cooperation, where the self is entangled with the contingencies of the other, in and of itself is a reflection of the impossibility of sovereign ownership over the self. That this kind of entanglement renders untenable the promise of the purity and the ownership of the self. So, given this kind of an intellectual mandate of the relationship between friendship and sovereignty, how did prominent Muslim scholars engage with this relationship between friendship and sovereignty in a context marked by the gradual but decisive loss of Muslim political sovereignty? So, main argument that I make in the book is that in these intra-Muslim debates on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship, we see competing conceptions of Islam and competing conceptions of Muslim sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. So that basically is sort of a broad executive summary, and now I will turn to further elaborating this argument, and then what I will do is take some fragments from one of the chapters in the book as an illustration, but in the comments, I'll be, of course, very happy to take any aspect, any chapters, but for the purpose of time, I thought I'll just focus on one chapter as an illustration. So, the central conceptual question that animates my interest is this: how does a religious community engage and draw on a normative tradition of law and ethics when the very political context that informed that tradition is no longer available? Though the pre-modern Muslim intellectual, and more specifically the Muslim legal tradition, is very diverse and multivalent on the question of Muslim, non-Muslim relations and friendship, it is nonetheless informed by a political context of Muslim imperial sovereignty, whereby establishing the supremacy of Islam and Muslim identity over non-Muslims represented a foundational purpose of law. So in the aftermath of Muslim political sovereignty, in a setting like mid-18th to mid-20th century India, how did Muslim legal discourses and debates on the question of interreligious, or more specifically Hindu-Muslim friendship, showcase the encounter between two things? One, the legacy of the pre-modern Muslim legal tradition, grounded in a political context of Muslim imperial sovereignty, and then two, the conditions, expectations, and categories of colonial modernity that had as its backdrop the loss of Muslim political sovereignty. So that encounter between these, the legacy of the pre-modern legal tradition and the conditions, expectations, and categories of colonial modernity, that encounter being the site for creative, ambiguous reflections on the question of Hindu-Muslim friendship, that encounter of that site is of primary significance and importance to me. And my main argument is that in these Muslim legal debates on the boundaries of interreligious friendship in Islam, competing notions of interreligious friendship corresponded with competing notions of sovereign power in the aftermath of Muslim political sovereignty. But more specifically, I argue that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty in 19th century India, as the resurrection of a Muslim state became an impossibility, for some of the most prominent Indian Muslim scholars and jurists of this moment, sovereign power came to increasingly reside in establishing and preserving markers of Muslim distinction and difference in everyday ritual life, invested in practices like cow sacrifice that will be the main topic of my comments today. Thus, somewhat paradoxically, the loss of political sovereignty made possible an expanded notion and sphere of politics and sovereign power that was not territorial nor bound to the state, but was situated in the domain of everyday ritual practice and premised on the desire to maintain and preserve embodied difference and distinction over non-Muslim others. Now, let me walk you through and further clarify this main argument with the help of an illustrative example. A few days ago was the 100-year anniversary of the end of the Ottoman state, or for some, the Ottoman Caliphate, in 1924. And the example I want to talk about is from that context almost exactly a century ago, from 1920 more specifically, concerning what is among the most consequential Muslim intellectual and political movements of the modern period, what is known as the Khilafat or the Caliphate movement. The Khilafat movement likely needs no introduction to this audience, but just in case, closely allied with the non-cooperation movement of Mohandas Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, the Khilafat movement was initiated in 1919 by a group of Muslim political leaders and intellectuals, several of whom were educated at Western institutions of learning, though it also included some prominent seminary-educated Muslim traditionalist scholars, as they're called in the Western Academy, or who are known as the ulama, singular, alim, as well. The Khilafat movement was animated by the political mission of protecting the Ottoman Caliphate from what its leaders saw as the colonizing designs and aggression of the British in the Arab Middle East following World War I. And its main objective, thus, was to pressure the British colonial government to preserve the geographic boundaries and the spiritual and political authority of the Ottoman Caliphate. The leaders and scholars of this movement, a couple of whom we will soon meet, sought to achieve this mission by calling on all Indian Muslims to sever and cut off all civic ties, what they called tarke muwalat, cut off all civic ties and relationship of citizenship with the British state. In fact, some of them, such as the famous Muslim modernist scholar and poet called Abul Kalam Azad, died 1958, who became India's first education minister after independence. This scholar Azad went to the extent of even arguing that launching a war or jihad against the British state was an individual obligation for every Indian Muslim, a form of individual obligation that is known as Fardul Ain in Islamic law. Among the cornerstones of the Khilafat movement lay in its argument that in forging a united front against the British, Indian Muslims must cultivate a relationship of political, friendship, and intimacy with the Hindu community. Now, crucially, and this is an important point for me, the leaders and scholars of the Khilafat movement did not make this argument for Hindu-Muslim intimacy through recourse to some liberal secular logic of pluralism, but squarely through the sources of the Sharia or Islamic law. More specifically, the protagonists of the Khilafat movement, such as Abul Kalam Azad, whom I just mentioned, argued for Hindu-Muslim friendship by mobilizing two specific verses from the Quran, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 60, that is titled The Woman Examined, Surah Mumtahana, the relevant parts of which are on your handout as item number 3. Supriya, you don't have a handout? God says, the Quran says, God does not forbid you from showing kindness to those unbelievers who do not fight you on account of your faith and neither drive you forth from your homes. God only forbids you to turn in friendship towards those unbelievers who do these things, who do fight against you because of your faith and drive you forth from your homes or aid others in driving you forth. So according to the Khilafat movement leaders and scholars, the category of non-Muslims described in the first verse as those who do not fight you because of your faith, lam yuqatilukum fid din, and to whom Muslims can thus harbor relationships of friendship were the Hindus. And those who do fight you because of your faith and to whom Indian Muslims should thus harbor enmity, not amity, were the British because of their designs to destroy the Ottoman Caliphate. Now, this argument sparked and catalyzed a massively consequential debate among Indian Muslim scholars, having to do with the following fundamental question. What are the limits of interreligious friendship in Islamic law? In the context of colonial India, for instance, was there a distinction to be made between the British and the Hindus in terms of their normative allowance for friendship? For the remainder of this talk, I want to explain how competing Muslim legal scholars in early 20th century India offered contrasting narratives and answers to this question through what they understood as the correct and normatively sound interpretation of Islamic law. And for that, I will turn to what is perhaps the most fascinating, instructive, and certainly among the most controversial issues related to the larger question of interreligious and more specifically Hindu-Muslim friendship according to Islamic law, the issue of cow sacrifice. Recently, in the contemporary Indian context, the history of and the violence generated by the Hindu nationalist cow protection movement that has unleashed particularly gruesome violence against the Muslim minority of the country has attracted tremendous popular as well as scholarly attention and alarm. But investing ethical and political attachments to the body of the cow is not a solely Hindu phenomenon, but one that animated copious and often charged debates among some of the most towering Indian Muslim scholars as well. By taking you to a moment almost exactly a century ago, I will try to show and argue that the cow and the question of its life and death represented a site not only of tremendous contestation and controversy, but also one that made visible contrasting visions of law and sovereignty in a world defined by the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. The intra-Muslim conflict over cow sacrifice that I'm about to describe unfolded in a colonial public sphere pulsating with competing voices and normative claims, legal battles, and even violent contestations on the cow. In 1893 alone, over 100 people were killed in communal violence over cow slaughter in towns across India. Controversies over the cow question also populated the press and other popular venues. For example, this is an image from the November 1881 issue of the famous satirical Urdu weekly called Awadh Punch, published from Lucknow in northern India between 1877 and 1937 and modeled on the London-based weekly Punch. Here we see a cow with the head and ears of a donkey being pulled in opposite directions by a group of Muslim butchers on the one side and Hindus of different castes on the other. Above the cow, we see written the word ta'assub, bigotry or intolerance, thus framing cow slaughter through a modernist lens as a contestation between crossfire of competing varieties of religious obscurantism. Back to intra-Muslim debates over cow sacrifice. While opinions on this matter varied considerably, for heuristic purposes, we can posit two broad tendencies found among the Indian Muslim scholarly elite. On the one hand, was a group of scholars who urged the Indian Muslim masses to refrain from cow slaughter and sacrifice on occasions like Eid, so as not to offend the normative sensibilities of the Hindu community. The exhortation that Indian Muslims must keep away from cow sacrifice and instead sacrifice other animals like goats and sheep represented a key ingredient of the attempt on the part of the Khilafat movement, leaders and scholars to foster Hindu-Muslim solidarity and camaraderie. And once again, their argument was based not on some abstract appeal to liberal pluralism, but on the specific Islamic legal observation that cow sacrifice is not an obligatory, wajib, but only a simply permissible practice in Islamic law. Hence, refraining from it posed no normative pitfalls. I'll come to this argument in a moment. Now, another group of Muslim scholars, the other side of the argument, however, vigorously resisted and opposed this argument. They counter-argued that cow sacrifice was a symbol of Muslim distinction in India, what is known as Sha'ar-e-Islam, plural Sha'ar-e-Islam, and thus abandoning this practice amounted to the shame and humiliation of Muslims. While they agreed that cow sacrifice and the consumption of beef were generally not obligatory in Islamic law, their argument was that in the specific context of colonial India, abandoning a distinctive symbol of Islam for the sake of appeasing or under the pressure or coercion of Hindus was forbidden. Therefore, by implication for Indian Muslims, cow sacrifice was indeed obligatory. Let me now turn to an elaboration of these two opposing positions and to an explication of what was at stake for the scholars who held these positions. I want to begin with the latter position, mainly that cow sacrifice must not be halted because it represents a marker of Muslim distinction over non-Muslims in the public sphere. And for that, I want to turn to the thought of the most formidable exponent of this position, a towering Muslim jurist and Sufi master called Ahmad Raza Khan, died 1921, who is the founder of what is among the most influential Muslim reform movements in the modern world, called the Barelvi School. The Barelvi School is named after the town of Bareilly in Uttar Pradesh, northern India, where Ahmad Raza Khan was from, and it is best known for its active veneration of Prophet Muhammad and the preservation of his elevated status as God's most beloved subject. This scholar, Khan, was a virtuoso polymath and excelled and wrote widely in all disciplines of the Muslim humanities, including Quran interpretation and commentary, Sufism, Hadith, law, philosophy, and even the natural sciences. He was also an arch polemicist who fought biting intellectual battles on several fronts against other Muslim and non-Muslim groups and individuals. Khan was at the center of the cow sacrifice debate. His most comprehensive and widely circulated, cited, and contested text on this topic, to a close reading of which I will now turn, is called The Finest Viewpoint on Cow Sacrifice, Anfus al-Fiqr fi Qurban al-Bakr, henceforth the finest viewpoint. This Urdu text, liberally interspersed with Arabic, was composed as a legal opinion or fatwa in 1880. By tracing the trajectory of Khan's legal discourse, I will highlight ways in which he presented cow sacrifice as a symbol of Muslim distinction, shi'ar Islam. I will argue that for Khan, in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, the cow, or more accurately, the death of the cow, held the promise of Muslim sovereign power and dominance in the realm of ritual life. Khan composed this text, The Finest Viewpoint, in response to the following question posed to him by a questioner from the town of Moradabad in northern India in 1880, which is on your handout as item number 6. And here I'll give you a break from my voice, and maybe, Suvaid, could you read that aloud? Everyone can hear. This is number 6. The question.
In the Hanafi school of law, the predominant Muslim legal school in South Asia, is cow sacrifice. Sorry, let me repeat. In the Hanafi school of law, the predominant Muslim legal school in South Asia, is cow sacrifice an obligatory practice such that abandoning it would constitute a sin that harms a Muslim's salvation or puts her outside the fold of Islam. What about someone who believes cow sacrifice and consumption of beef as permissible, but does not actually sacrifice cows or consume beef? Would the salvational prospects of such a person be injured? Is there any sin attached to a Muslim who, while understanding cow sacrifice, a permissible practice, nonetheless refrains from it in consideration of the disorder and unrest that this act might generate, potentially bringing harm to the Muslim community?
Thank you, Suvaid. So the central interpretive puzzle at the heart of the set of questions has to do with the non-obligatory status of cow sacrifice and beef consumption in Islamic law. In Islamic law, practices are broadly categorized as obligatory, praying, fasting, etc., forbidden, alcohol consumption, eating pork, etc., or as simply permissible, or what is known as mubah, meaning practices that are neither obligatory nor forbidden, the commission or omission of which bear no salvational consequences. Generally, cow sacrifice falls under this last category. It is neither obligatory nor forbidden, but simply permissible. So the interpretive challenge confronting Ahmad Raza Khan was just to show that in the specific context of colonial India, cow sacrifice was not simply permissible, but in fact obligatory. How did he go about doing that? The centerpiece of Khan's argument lay in his attempt to draw on and highlight the dynamicity of the Islamic legal tradition. The normative value of a practice in Islamic law, meaning is it obligatory, forbidden, etc., the normative value of a practice, he emphasized, was contingent on the conditions in which that practice takes place. In building his case, he cited the well-known principle in Islamic law that, and I quote, the legal ruling on a given matter revolves around the effective cause informing that ruling. Inna al-hukma yaduru ma illatihi. Drawing from this principle, Khan explained that obligations and prohibitions stipulated in the Sharia or Islamic law depended not only on the intrinsic nature of an act, but also the external conditions and context that enwrap that act. This is why Khan assembled his argument further. During Prophet Muhammad's life, women were allowed entrance in mosques to offer the 5 daily prayers. But in the years following his death, as the Muslim community expanded and the threat of moral chaos or fitna through sexual attraction became more palpable, women were barred from entering mosques. Despite their seeming opposition, there was no contradiction between these two normative positions. The latter modification in the law was simply a reflection of the demands of a new set of conditions. Now, connecting this discussion to the cow question, Khan argued that similarly, even though cow sacrifice was only simply permissible in and of itself, in the specific context and conditions of colonial India, cow sacrifice represented among the foremost signs and markers of Muslim distinction in the public sphere, and hence deliberately refraining from this practice as an exercise in Hindu-Muslim friendship and under any pressure or coercion of the Hindus was not permissible. Why? Because this involved the extinction of a marker of Muslim distinction and, in effect, the diminution and humiliation of Islam and the elevation of Islam's rivals. Now, this category of public markers of Muslim distinction over non-Muslims that I've already mentioned a few times, what is called shi'ar or sha'a'ir Islam, was critical to Khan's interpretive apparatus. This is item 7 on your handout, and referred to in the Quran primarily with regards to Muslim obligatory practices like the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj. In late 19th and 20th century Indian Muslim legal discourses, the category of shi'ar became cemented as an index of Muslim distinction in a much wider ambit of everyday rituals and practices, to also include practices like cow sacrifice, slaughter, and beyond. At the heart of Khan's argument thus was the claim that since cow sacrifice was a public marker of distinction that distinguished Indian Muslims from other religious communities, it signified Islam's honor and dominance in the public sphere. In the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, it was in ritual life and performance that sovereign power was enshrined. Now, what I want us to notice here is that conceptually, Khan's interpretive program articulated and presumed an imperial Muslim political theology, whereby the underlying purpose of law was the maintenance and preservation of Islam's dominance and power in the public sphere. Law represented a simulacrum for sovereign power. Moreover, Khan's legal imaginary took for granted the grammar and assumptions of Muslim imperial sovereignty that had informed the formulation of concepts like markers of Muslim distinction in medieval and early modern Muslim legal texts, composed in a context of Muslim imperial sovereignty. Despite the colonized status of Muslims in modern India, he assumed the perfect translatability in the modern period of discursive concepts and desires intimately entangled with the condition of pre-modern Muslim political sovereignty. But let me complicate matters a bit further here. While articulating and presuming an imperial Muslim political theology, it is not as if Ahmad Raza Khan was oblivious to or that he ignored the reality of British colonial power, under which he and Indian Muslims more broadly had to operate at this point. Exactly to the contrary, he was not only keenly aware of British presence, but also closely attuned to the opportunities and benefits afforded by that presence. So, for instance, while arguing for the preservation of Muslim markers of distinction, Khan frequently invoked the colonial promise of tolerance towards individual religious communities and of its commitment to ensuring the freedom of religion, mazhabi azadi. Pressuring Indian Muslims to abstain from cow sacrifice, he often proclaimed, and I quote him here, represented an abomination that the colonial authorities should never allow. Now, there are two aspects of Khan's engagement with colonial law and state that I wish to highlight. First, among his central strategic moves was to establish concordance between the objectives of Islamic law and the operative logics and objectives of colonial law. So, for instance, as I just mentioned, his whole argument is that even though cow sacrifice is not obligatory, in this specific context, Muslims being pressured into this practice was forbidden because that would bring shame and humiliation to the Indian Muslim community. It is an outcome that cannot be tolerated according to Islamic law. Now, Khan connected this pre-modern logic of Islamic jurisprudence, obviously informed by the pre-modern context of Muslim empire, to the modern colonial discourse on coercion. He claimed that the British should never allow the fracturing of a religious community's honor and freedom by tolerating its subjection to coercive subjugation. In effect, he stitched disparate yet intersecting threads in colonial and Islamic law to weave an overlapping normative argument. Second, in trying to demonstrate that precluding Muslims from the ritual of cow sacrifice constituted a breach of religious freedom, he first had to prove that this ritual of cow sacrifice was indeed holy and legitimately, quote-unquote, religious. This he sought to do most often by citing numerous Quranic verses and the Prophet's sayings or hadith that establish cow sacrifice as among the distinguishing markers of Islam. So, for instance, the most prominent such Quranic verse, verse 36 of chapter 22, reads as follows, "And as for the sacrifice of cattle, we have ordained it for you as among the symbols of distinction designated by God. وَالْبُدْنَ جَعَلْنَاهَا لَكُم مِّن شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ." Similarly, in a prophetic report cited in all 6 canonical books of Hadith in Sunni Islam, the Prophet's youngest wife and prolific Hadith narrator, Aisha bint Abi Bakr, died 678, reported that the Prophet had sacrificed a cow on behalf of his wives. Now, the main objective for Ahmad Raza Khan to mobilize such discursive fragments from the tradition was to prove, as he put it, that cow sacrifice is a religious ritual for Muslims normatively sanctioned by the Quran and the Prophet's normative model. But having established the religious character of cow sacrifice, he proceeded to remind colonial authorities of their duty to now honor the principle of religious freedom in an even-handed manner that does not privilege the sensibilities of one group over those of another. As he poignantly pleaded, and I quote him here, "Does religious freedom mean that in affirming the position and priorities of one community, another is compelled to cease the performance of its religious rituals?" End of quote. Now, Khan was by no means a liberal secular champion of religious freedom or mazhabi azadi as a normative ideal. What we find here instead is a seemingly illiberal actor's strategic deployment of liberal desires and principles for the advancement of his own agenda. Khan thus displayed remarkable adeptness at negotiating the political and institutional terrain of colonial rule in a manner most conducive to the integrity and the successful execution of his normative project. In fact, in among the most fascinating moves in this text, contrary to his broader argument, Khan in fact stipulated that Indian Muslims should in fact refrain from cow sacrifice in those public places where the colonial government has outlawed this practice. They should not break the law or contribute to the incitement of disorder, he sternly advised his followers. So, was this a gesture of affirming and embracing the virtues and duties of a good liberal citizen? Not quite. Here again, Khan's position was leavened first and foremost by the logic and imperative of securing Islam's power and stature in the public sphere. Muslims should not contravene the law, Khan reasoned, because getting punished or arrested as a result of doing so will bring insult and humiliation to Islam. In turn, this will elevate the position of Islam's rivals and enemies. Thus, curiously, in this instance, Khan's imperial Muslim political theology seamlessly coalesced with the colonial regulation of the public sphere via the law. Also, Khan's acquiescence to colonial law highlights that in addition to his apparently harsh and strict attitude on the issue of cow sacrifice, he was eminently capable of acting with unabashed pragmatism. He was not a radical exclusivist unhinged from the limits and power equations of the world he inhabited. Rather, his exclusivism was carefully choreographed so as to deftly combine fidelity to the normative ideal of Muslim exceptionalism with the more pragmatic concern for negotiating the monstrosity of colonial power. For the remainder of this talk, I now want to turn to key aspects of the position that Khan had so vigorously opposed, namely that Indian Muslims should indeed suspend cow sacrifice as a way to cultivate Hindu-Muslim harmony and through that establish a united political front to oppose the British. I will do so by focusing on the thought of arguably the most influential proponent and exponent of this view, someone called Qiyamuddin Abdul Bari, died 1926, a leading luminary of the prestigious Farangi Mahal School in South Asia, an institution known for its curricular emphasis on logic, philosophy, and the rationalist or maqulat disciplines. Bari was a prolific as well as a curious personality on the intellectual map of modern South Asian Islam, who escapes any neat categorization. While a firm Muslim traditionalist, meaning a Muslim scholar educated at a seminary or madrasa of the Hanafi legal school that dominates South Asia, he was also a driving force, indeed a leading protagonist of such otherwise modernist political enterprises as the Khilafat movement. His roughly 110 books of varied lengths included works on grammar, logic, law, theology, ethics, and Quran exegesis. He had also spent a formative year of his life in 1903, at the age of 25, traveling extensively in Yemen, Iraq, and Arabia, where he studied with and was granted certificates of expertise by various prominent local scholars. Among the pioneers of the Khilafat movement, Bari was arguably its most polyglot protagonist, who brought firm grounding in all branches of the Muslim humanities with demonstrable penchant and capacity for political and intellectual bricolage. Bari's thoughts and discourses on cow sacrifice are found in a number of his Urdu speeches, letters, and correspondences devoted to this problem, ranging from late 1919 to most of 1920, when the Khilafat movement was at its peak. Now, let me state at the outset what I will show through the following analysis. Bari's views on the cow were a lot more nuanced than a blanket prohibition against its sacrifice. Moreover, and this point is crucial to my concerns, while arguing for a position of interreligious friendship and hospitality between Hindus and Muslims that pushed for abstention from cow sacrifice, Bari was always careful to frame his argument in and ensure its consistency with Muslim traditionalist protocols and parameters of legal reasoning. How did he seek to accomplish that? At the heart of Bari's approach to this issue was a call to de-intensify the communal attachments invested in the cow. All involved parties, Bari emphasized, had to play their role in executing this process. Indian Muslims, he suggested, could refrain from explicitly airing their attachment to cow sacrifice as a marker of faith. And it was best for the Hindu community, on the other hand, to not come across as obstinate and stubborn on this issue and drop their insistence on the abandonment of cow sacrifice. Bari was acutely aware that he must not be seen as normatively obligating Indian Muslims to give up cow sacrifice, lest that throw him in a pit of doctrinal landmines. As he adamantly pronounced, and I quote him here, "I am not giving a fatwa or a legal opinion or even a recommendation pushing people to abandon cow slaughter. I'm just offering my preliminary opinion with a view to foster Hindu-Muslim unity," end of quote. Bari was also at pains to impress upon his readers that his position on refraining from cow sacrifice was not issued under the pressure of Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, one of the central points of rebuke lobbied by his opponents like Ahmad Raza Khan. "I did not abandon cow sacrifice on Gandhi's insistence. I did so on my own accord after much thought and deliberation and out of consideration for public welfare," maslaha. I'll come back to this category in a moment. In fact, he even went a step further to proclaim that had Gandhi asked me to give up cow sacrifice, I would never have done so. And this kind of a claim, the context is that the intimacy between Gandhi and Abdul Bari was quite well known. When Gandhi would visit Lucknow, he apparently would stay precisely in the room where Abdul Bari was born, in the Farangi Mahal sort of quarters. And so well known was their political collaboration that there was a slogan which was famous among the Indian National Congress activists that the ruling from Mahatma Gandhi and the fatwa from Abdul Bari. Hukum Gandhi ka, fatwa Abdul Bari ka. So this is sort of the background for why he's so insistent. But the key question here is, what public welfare or maslaha, as he said, might one derive from abandoning cow sacrifice? Bari's response to this question was fascinating. Bari inverted the very category of distinguishing markers of Islam, SherAli that his opponents like Ahmad Raza Khan had mobilized against him in his own favor. How? By arguing that the promise of Hindu-Muslim unity offered through the Muslim cessation of cow sacrifice represented a necessary political ingredient for resisting British colonial power and thus for salvaging the Ottoman Caliphate. And the Caliphate, he continued his argument, constituted a much more significant and sacred marker of Muslim distinction than did cow sacrifice. As he bluntly put it, what is the cow when put next to the caliphate? In a curious and important move, Bari did not contest or try to refute his opponent's claim that cow sacrifice indeed represented an important marker of Muslim distinction in South Asia. He readily admitted that yes, it was so. Moreover, he was also in agreement with the likes of Ahmad Raza Khan that Indian Muslims must not abandon cow sacrifice under the pressure or coercion of Hindus and their leaders like Gandhi. In fact, as I just pointed out, he explicitly called on the Hindu community to not act stubbornly on this issue. He was also quite comfortable in proposing that lower-income Muslims who could not afford lamb or other more expensive meats should continue cow sacrifice lest they refrain from it, even appear as a coerced act. Bari's argument for halting cow sacrifice as a gesture of interreligious friendship thus did not rest on vitiating cow sacrifice as a ritual practice or in diminishing or challenging its importance to the ritual lives of South Asian Muslims. Instead, he framed his program for forging Hindu-Muslim unity as what he intriguingly called an exception to the norm, kharqul Adda, whereby a marker of Muslim distinction, that of cow sacrifice, was, so to say, itself sacrificed to safeguard a much more vital and coveted marker of Muslim distinction, the caliphate. In essence, Bari packaged the cultivation of Hindu-Muslim harmony and friendship as a departure from the norm, kharqul Adda, necessitated by a moment of politico-theological tribulation for the Muslim community with the caliphate under grave threat. And by doing so, he astutely maintained his normative loyalty to the principle of Muslim exceptionalism that is central to the operative logics of Islamic law, while also justifying the temporary exception of Hindu-Muslim friendship precipitated by political necessity. Bari's focus to the twin task of demonstrating that he was not advocating repealing a public marker of Muslim distinction and that his proposal for refraining from cow sacrifice did not involve any hint of Hindu coercion or pressure was in the realization that in a legal imaginary wedded to the ideal and primacy of Muslim sovereign power, not being seen as undermining that power was his most formidable interpretive challenge. Abdul Bari's attempt to convince Indian Muslims that they refrain from cow sacrifice, though, was not free of ambiguities. The most glaring such ambiguity is reflected in the following question. How was one to determine whether refraining from cow sacrifice in any instance was one's own decision or was a product of external pressure or coercion? How was one to differentiate between decision and coercion, and who would decide that and how? Bari left these questions unaddressed. But as to his own practice on the question of cow sacrifice, he left little ambiguity. In a letter penned in August of 1920, he explicitly declared, and I quote him, "I will not sacrifice cows during the next Eid al-Adha, and it is my desire that other Muslims also imitate me in this practice of abstention." So let me conclude by summing up what I have tried to argue today. I have primarily tried to make three connected but distinct arguments. One, Muslim legal debates and disagreements on Hindu-Muslim friendship more broadly, and on issues like cow sacrifice more specifically, were informed by and articulated competing visions and understandings of Muslim sovereign power in a political context defined by the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. For Ahmad Raza Khan, for instance, the cow, or rather the death of the cow, presented the promise and possibility of securing Muslim dominance and distinction. A lot rested on the cow. At stake in the cow sacrifice was the sovereign power of the Indian Muslim community. From the ruins of Muslim political sovereignty, the erasure of the cow offered the promise of an imperial Muslim political theology, nestled in the comforting fiction of communal dominance. On the other hand, for a scholar like Maulvi Abdul Bari, the cow was equally important, for it contained the promise of an interreligious alliance and friendship necessary for Muslim political survival. Notice that much like his rival Khan, Bari also considered the cow pregnant with power, though for him, power was enshrined not in everyday ritual practices and markers of distinction in the public sphere as it did for Khan, but in the imperative of restoring a coveted marker of Muslim political sovereignty, the institution of the caliphate. For Bari and even for Abul Kalam Azad, while maintaining Muslim dominance in the public performance of rituals was important, its significance paled in comparison to the caliphate's aura and sacrality. But what I want us to notice is that for all their disagreement, their competing positions hinged on the shared normative desire to carve a certain vision and notion of sovereignty in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. Argument number two. In these legal discourses on Hindu-Muslim friendship, we find a complex, conflictual, and fascinating negotiation between the logics and aspirations of a particular reading of Islamic law, grounded in a pre-modern context of Muslim empire, and the conditions and structures of modern colonial power. This is perhaps best seen in Ahmad Raza Khan's simultaneous invocation of the pre-modern Muslim imperial mandate of establishing and maintaining domination over non-Muslims through the preservation of markers of Muslim distinction, and then the thoroughly modern colonial language of religious freedom to argue that the British state must never allow the erasure of a ritual like cow sacrifice that is so central to Muslim identity and politics in South Asia. Similarly, to add a point that I did not make earlier, Even the leaders and scholars of the Khilafat movement combined a desire to restore a symbol of Muslim imperial sovereignty like the Caliphate, while drawing on the very category of religious freedom to argue, in this case, that the British must not trample its own secular principle of religious freedom by attacking the much revered and religiously sensitive institution of the Caliphate. This interface between pre-modern Islamic legal imaginaries and the conditions, categories, and expectations of the modern colonial moment is precisely the site where the aspirations as well as the tensions and anxieties attached to the ethics of interreligious friendship becomes most visible and palpable. And finally, argument number 3. The terms and texture of these intra-Muslim legal debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship are far too complicated to render tenable the temptation of approaching them through attractive yet distorting binaries like traditional, modern, liberal, illiberal, inclusive, exclusive, secular, religious, tolerant, intolerant, and so on. For instance, it was the modernist Abul Kalam Azad who argued for the seemingly pluralist gesture of Hindu-Muslim collaboration, but that did not prevent him from calling jihad against the British an obligation for every Indian Muslim. In fact, it was Ahmad Raza Khan, the seemingly strict and harsh-sounding scholar on interreligious friendship, who in this instance took the more pragmatic position of strongly opposing any war with the powerful British state. And he did that by invoking the Quranic phrase, "Don't with your own hands throw yourselves on the path of destruction. La tulqu bi ayyidikum ila tahluka. Bi aydiyikum ila tahluka." Similarly, Abdul Bari of the Farangi Mahal school advocated the seemingly pluralist position that Muslims should abstain from cow sacrifice to honor the religious sensibilities of the Hindu community, but he did so explicitly through a traditionalist legal hermeneutic. Remember, he even argued that if the Hindus insisted that Muslims have to abandon cow sacrifice, that insistence will paradoxically turn this ritual into an obligation. All these examples highlight the impossibility of canonizing intra-Muslim legal discourses and disagreement on important normative questions like interreligious friendship into easily digestible binary framings and explanations. These thinkers and their thought are far too complex and non-linear for such a possibility. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, SherAli, for this wonderfully detailed kind of view into the internal dynamics. I was reminded of something I read about of Ahmed Khan Barelvi, that he loved the postal system because it allowed communication, but he always put the stamp upside down to protest against the colonial implementation of this. So this is kind of a double gesture. So we are fortunate to have two commentators on the presentation and the book. We have here Professor Supriya Gandhi from Yale. She is an assistant professor of religious studies at Yale, focusing on Islam and Indic religions in South Asia, as well as the emergence of modern Hinduism. She is the author of the wonderfully named The Emperor Who Never Was, Darashikoh in Mughal India, and is now working on a book entitled Universal Religion, Persianate Hinduism in Colonial India. So welcome, Supriya. And then we also have a second commentator. I'm just going to introduce them both together, who is Dr. Suvaid Yaseen of our own, who got a PhD in history at Brown in 2022 and currently is visiting assistant professor for both history and religious studies at Brown. His dissertation is entitled Islamic Intersections, Religion and Politics in Kashmir in the Long 20th Century, and which won multiple prizes. So welcome, Suvaid, as well, to the perch that we have. And so we will go one each, and then we will open up to a general discussion.
Well, you know, I sort of thought that sitting would be a little more informal and bring us more into discussion mode, but I'm happy to stand also, you know, whatever you prefer. And
Well, then I think
we can also come and
SherAli
join.
and Suvaid should come and sit down.
Sure.
okay.
And Shehzad also.
So, I'd like to thank everyone at Brown who made this event possible, and I'd like to thank SherAli for giving us this very substantial and thought-provoking book. In many ways, it continues some of the themes discussed in his first book. It's like his previous book, Perilous Intimacies, is about many things. It brings together an intricate web of themes and ideas, some of which we've seen in the talk. And of course, it's impossible to adequately discuss all of them. But I'd sort of like to underscore that she really in both books excels at giving us these intricate glimpses into complex theological debates, but also showing us their wider significance. And I think, he does that sort of really brilliantly, and that's a remarkable contribution. Now, my comments are going to focus on a key argument of SherAli's book and some of its related concepts. And this is the argument as SherAli, as you frame it in the outset. It's an argument that traces what happens to a certain imperial Muslim political theology after the loss of Muslim sovereignty in the subcontinent resulting from the entrenchment of colonial rule. And in Tareen's account, and again, I'm very sympathetic to this political theology comes to be translated and transported in the radically transformed conditions of modern colonial power. So instead of upholding an imperial political formation, it finds a new location in, again, I'm quoting from Tareen, the performance of everyday ritual life and the desire for an attachment to supremacy over the religious other through the maintenance of embodied distinction in everyday life. So, end quote. So I'm going to raise four questions about this argument, and I'm going to focus most on the first question, and then I'm going to sort of run through the other questions. And the first question is sort of how might we best characterize what SherAli names as this imperial political theology, and how might we do so without necessarily reading back, back projecting from what the ulema discussed in this book might have conceived of this political theology. And of course, concepts like this are heuristic tools. They both reveal and elide. They necessarily generalize in order to make a larger point. But by widening the concept of the imperial well beyond the specificities of Muslim empires in South Asia, what is lost and what is gained. And if, as Tareen sort of defines this, imperial political theology is characterized by, and again I'm quoting, conjoining the aspiration for Muslim sovereign power over other faith communities with this assumption of theological superiority. And then if it's also buttressed by this tradition of Islamic jurisprudence that also is invested in this maintenance of dominance. So we certainly have a picture here that would resonate with many of the colonial era ulema discussed in this book. But when we're talking about Muslim sovereign power, whose power? Is it the Sultan's power? Is it the power of the ulema? And then to what extent, again, would many of these figures you discuss, like Sayyid Ahmad Khan or Nazir Ahmad or Maulana Azad, to what extent would they have actually necessarily agreed with or been comfortable with the very complex intellectual and social world of pre-modern scholars, nobles, and rulers, and so on. So, take, for example, the very an instance that SherAli provides to illustrate this discussion of imperial political theology. And this is the fascinating example of the 10th century philosopher Al-Amiri, the author of Al-Alam bi-Manaqib al-Islam. Now, Al-Amiri was associated with the philosopher Al-Kindi, in whose circle was produced the translation of Plotinus's Aeneads, kind of known as in Islamic circles as a theology of Aristotle, and it proved to have a massive impact on Islamic thought by, again, disseminating this emanationist paradigm that many Muslim philosophers restated in a number of different ways. And so, in Al-Amiri's time, a major concern was reconciling religion and rational philosophy. And, Sir Wilfred Cantwell Smith comments on how unusual it is to actually have Islam in the title of many pre-modern works. And, it's pretty, to objectify sort of Islam like this. And of course, Al-Amiri is not using Islam, this reified 19th century way, as a world religion. But, it's partly perhaps because of the sajaa, the kind of rhyme, but also, for Al-Amiri, I think this view of Islam is shaped by emanationist philosophy, and it continues a discourse that's already operative in late antiquity, regarding Islam as an expression of divine design and natural order restored through prophecy. So it's a bit, of course, it's a bit different from the later ulama. And it's interesting in this case that he actually doesn't refer to Muslims, but he refers to al-Hanifiyya, which also indicates a more sort of universal sort of monotheism. Again, together with this, the idea of jurisprudence as the central expression of Islamic political theologies. When viewed, again, sort of from a modern lens, it sort of risks also reinscribing the binary of Sufi and jurist, and I know that's a binary that you dismantle in your first book, which is, of course, it's very hard to speak of law in Islamic societies without also speaking of Sufism. And the late Shahab Ahmed wrote of the Sufi philosophical amalgam, but I think one might profitably also call it the Sufi philosophical legal amalgam. And I'm saying this not only because there were many ulama who were also Sufis, but you could also argue that this whole Sufi philosophical complex was also legal in orientation. And by legal, I mean that these discourses promote an idea of existence and cosmic order as entirely in accordance with divine revelation. And we also see in cases that Sufis become the arbiters of law. So for instance, the charismatic Sufi Ahmad-e-Jam, who comes to be really important sort of for late Timurids and Mughals, he performed a bunch of miracles, but he also insisted on enforcing the legal injunction of forbidding wrong and commanding right. Or even Ibn Arabi, for whom, again, a figure like him could determine the authenticity of legal maxims and prophetic hadiths. So we, often tend to view these instances as this is opposed to the legalistic order. But how about actually viewing this as, very much part of law in Muslim societies? And one of the reasons why these discourses are important to discussions of political theology is that they come to play a prominent role in Muslim empires. So we see in Mughal India, we see this form of sacred kingship that appropriates and competes with the charismatic authority of Sufi sheikhs. And the elevated status of emperors, it draws from a variety of currents, whether it's sort of the philosopher Suhrawardi's idea of ta'alluq, or sort of self-deification, or Ibn Arabi's idea of the perfect man. And these ideas themselves were enfolded within a broader framework of sort of akhlaq political theory that at once affirmed a universal anthropology as well as a hierarchical cosmic order. It's from such a context that we have a variety of engagements with Indic learning. But again, this political theology of sacred kingship isn't certainly one that the colonial era ulama would endorse. So we have a very different thing going on with Maulana Azad's championing of the caliphate. So kind of what do we make of these disjuncts? Sort of as part of actually what one might characterize as a Mughal political theology. SherAli used sensitively adumbrate the engagements with Hindu ideas and practices of the Sufi Mirza Mazhar Jane-Janan, who came from a family associated with the Mughal state. And in one of Jane-Janan's letters, provides a really sympathetic account of Hindu thought. And he draws equivalences with Islamic concepts wherever possible. So for instance, SherAli, I have a slightly different reading of some of the things, I think what you read as Dharma Shastra, I actually read as Jane-Janan's expounding of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy. And he describing the stages of life for tri-spawn castes in terms of Sufi liberation. And he also finds a way to justify Hindu image worship and prostration by drawing an analogy to the Muslim practice of greeting by saying salam. And, SherAli, while acknowledging Jane-Janan's hospitality, SherAli also observes that this friendship to the Hindu other is preconditioned on the assumption that the sovereign authority and privilege of Islam was kept in place. And, this may well be, but Jane-Janan was also drawing on an earlier concept of interreligious comparison that was familiar to Mughal royals like Jahangir and Dara Shikoh. And it's a kind of based on the concept of tatbiq, which often, connoted a method of reconciling differences by identifying a shared ontology at the core of the different systems of thought examined. So whether these systems of thought are different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, as in Shah Waliullah, or whether it's comparing Hindu ideas with Muslim ideas, there's this presumption of a notion of universal truth underpinning them. That's sort of at the core of this comparative gesture. I'm going to sort of quickly move on to my other questions. And my second question is, what are some of the social and political mechanisms through which these imperial discourses, or what you're terming as imperial political theology, transferred from pre-colonial imperial sort of locales to the context of Muslim publics in colonial India? And, of course, it's not easy to kind of deal with all of this in the space of a single book. But, we have the first chapter that does this lovely reading of Jane Janan, and then we jump 100 years to Nanotvi, and this fierce interreligious polemic in the late 19th century that is taking place with Nanotvi and Dayana and Saraswati. So it's a very different world. So again, if we're talking about the transference of these imperial political theologies, sort of what happens in this intervening period. And again, it's something that I'm really sympathetic to, because my own work deals with the transference also of imperial discourses, but looking at the community of Hindu scholar bureaucrats who served the Mughal state and later the colonial state. And what I actually find is that even as these scholar bureaucrats are sort of abandoning Persian, in some cases gradually, in other cases actively, there are certain ideas of universal religion that take on a new shape. Compared to the 18th centuries, and they actually get enfolded into articulations of universal Hinduism, now with an aim to draw harder boundaries around communities. My third question goes back to the ulama, who are the subject of your study. And it's about, I was wondering, how do the ulama actually become a group? Because if you crack open any 17th century chronicle, you're going to find people described as ulama who are also warriors, they're also mystics, they're all members of Sufi orders. And then you have in the 19th century and early 20th century, you have these mammoth projects of memorialization, whether it's Rahman Ali's Tazkira-e Ulama-e Hind, or whether it is the Abdul Hayy al-Hassani's mammoth Nuzhat al-Khawatir fi Hindustan. So these are retrospective tendencies to imagine the ulama as a stable transhistoric class that kind of always existed like this. So, so for the ulama to imagine, to get invested in this idea of sovereignty, but not invested in this idea of secret rulership, sort of what happens to them to make this possible. And my final question is, you have these sort of tantalizing lines at the end of your book, and you say that the analysis presented in this book presses the importance of imagining a horizon of interreligious and Hindu-Muslim friendship that is not imperiled by pathological inheritances of imperial political theologies, nor leavened by the seductive yet frequently sour promises of modern secular power and state sovereignty. So, maybe if you could say something a bit more about this vision, and thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to stand, but you guys can. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Before I begin my response as a discussant, I wanted to start by thanking Professor SherAli Tareen for making the trip to Providence during a very busy time. It's such a pleasure to have you here finally. I sent the invite to SherAli in early November, and since then the number of back and forth emails have crossed many a dozen. I will not reveal the number. I consulted him on various dates, formats, logistics, a lot of important trivia. That is to say, SherAli has been very generous and very patient. Thank you. I also want to thank Professor Wazir Zamindar, as always, for helpful suggestions and support. Professor Shahzad Bashir for generously taking time and effort and to moderate today's event. Special thanks to Professor Supriya Gandhi for graciously agreeing to travel down from Yale during what was otherwise supposed to be her spring break. And lend real intellectual heft to the panel of the two discussants. Imagine if it was just me alone.
Of course, this event would not have been possible without the support of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia. Thank you to Professor Ashutosh Varshni. Finally, my foremost thanks to Mr. Pawan Pandey, he just left, our program manager here, and Natalia, our events and communications manager, both of whom did a really incredible job in arranging the logistics for this event. Now, moving on to my job as a discussant today, my brief remarks consist of 2 parts. Firstly, I want to highlight some of the stakes of Tareen's book, which I found helpful personally and important, especially the historiography it contents against, and the rich complexity that introduces into discussions on Islam across pre-modern and modern South Asia. Secondly, I want to lay out a set of reflections as a ground to ask a few questions, questions that I sometimes get asked in relation to my own work and do not always have good answers for. So basically, I want to use this occasion to mine some ideas from SherAli, although with the hope that they can also be helpful for a broader discussion. Since he has already explained the key concepts and arguments of the book, I will not go into definitions of the terms. So let me begin with the first part, that is the stakes. Tareen's work, and here I'm not just thinking with the book Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire, published by Columbia in 2023 that we are discussing today, but his overall scholarship, his first book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, came out in 2020. Please note the second book came within 3 years, which is quite, to be honest, intimidating. So 2 major books, in addition to many articles, thought pieces, as well as a range of public lectures in the US and overseas. There is a whole range of them, all of which, to put very succinctly, argue against the flattening of Muslim social, religious, and political thought across early modern and modern South Asia. As Tareen reminds us, Muslim thought, especially in the context of modern South Asia, has often been examined as a problem. That is to say, while colonial historians sought to dismiss or caricaturize a range of Muslim thinkers and actors, especially the traditionalist educated scholars, the ulama, the post-colonial academic scholarship has also looked at them mostly as remnants of a bygone era, housed within or in association with various Islamic seminaries. They have been considered increasingly irrelevant to the modern condition, as they seemingly had nothing remarkable to contribute to the lives of modern citizens of post-colonial nation states. Attention, when bestowed, has mostly been on actors who could be placed within the spectrum of modernizing or nationalist influences. For example, an educationist such as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the founder of Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in 1875, which would transform into the famous Aligarh Muslim University in early 20th century. Or a leader such as Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who could be studied in context of the heritage of the broader Indian anti-colonial movement, in conversation with the context of a political Hindu-Muslim friendship, to use subtitle of Tareen's book. So while such important figures are examined by Tareen too, Perilous Intimacies puts them into conversation with a range of other actors, Sufis such as Mazhar-e-Jan Janan, ulama from Deoband, Qasim Nanotwi and Qari Tayyib, Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvi School of Thought, Abdul Bari of Farangi Mahal fame, as well as literary figures such as Nazir Ahmad Dehlavi, among others. In presenting what Tareen argues is a bird's eye view of major varieties of South Asian Islam, the work moves beyond historiographical binaries of liberal versus conservative, traditional versus modernist streams of thought, to delineate complex interconnections. Moreover, the discussions seamlessly move across geographies and temporalities to summon a vast range of Islamic thinkers, jurists, philosophers, canonical as well as lesser-known figures. In engaging with the questions derived from the long colonial present, the narrative in Tareen's work mirrors the rich and complex temporalities of his interlocutors, a conversation within the trans-regional and trans-historical Islamic discursive tradition. Thus, in line with works of other major scholars of Islam, especially figures such as Muhammad Qasim Zaman, Ibrahim Musa, Brannon Ingram, to name a few, who have opened up new ways of thinking about Islamic traditionalist thinking as dynamic and adaptive, Tareen's work not only complicates the historiographical frameworks, but also illuminates a rich yet largely unattended archive of Islamic intellectual and anti-colonial thought. But most importantly, in doing so, while he examines it with expert attention to the terms of the tradition itself, he does not shy away from exploring difficult and possibly contentious lines of inquiry. That is, the construction of difference as well as intimacy with religious and political others, which on one hand lends coherence to the tradition, but at the same time also threatens to unravel its contours. Tareen proposes and thinks with the paradigm of what he calls an imperial political theology as the normative underpinning of South Asian Islamic traditionalist thought. He then shows how, in the context of the loss of political sovereignty in the 19th century, a range of everyday Islamic rituals and practices in South Asia took on new meanings as sovereign claims, which sought to mark the discursive separation as well as social and political boundaries of the Muslim community. In doing so, he introduces an exhaustive, less restricted understanding of sovereignty and delineates the complex and vast everyday terrain on which discursive, social, and political battles take place. In so arguing, Tareen's examples complicate many of the otherwise common sense points or generic frameworks of Islam in South Asia. For example, in chapter 4 of the book, we come across Ahmad Raza Khan, Tareen talked about him earlier, associated with the Barelvi devotional forms of Islam, often seen as apolitical and less threatening in contrast to the reformist trends. Khan is insistent on maintaining Muslim ritual purity and importance of cow sacrifice as a marker of as a distinct and unnegotiable marker of Muslim community. He does so even at the cost of possibilities of political friendship, which the Indian Khilafat movement in support of the Ottoman Caliphate represented for many, and to which Gandhi famously lent its support. Thus, the representative of a devotional and apparently apolitical understanding of Islam, the good Islam in many cases, Khan insisted on the sovereign difference in everyday ritual practices as against a common anti-coloniality across religious traditions. Curiously, in doing so, he also mirrored the views of the famous Deobandi Sufi scholar SherAli Tareen, who would also otherwise be among his most bitter polemical opponents. In another example, detailed in chapter 6, the modernist educator Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, through his insistence to prioritize the foundational sources of Islamic tradition, joins the discursive ranks of the textualist Ahl Hadith movement in rejecting the historical schools of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. Even so, the traditionalist principle of the Deoband seminary, Qazi Tayyib, is seen invoking Ibn Taymiyyah, the famous late 13th, early 14th century jurist, as he schools Sir Syed about the methodologies of Islamic traditionalist thinking. Perilous Intimacies is rich with such examples which question and complicate the historiographical binaries. Yet while it shows swift intellectual cross-connections across various figures and schools of thought, it does not minimize the differences either, but takes discursive claims seriously. In doing so, Tareen demonstrates how the registers of intra-Muslim difference are critical to think with in relation to the arguments about interreligious boundaries, as well as the perils and possibilities of interreligious friendship. Such registers are way more nuanced than the simplistic binaries of modern and archaic modes of Islamic thinking would have us believe. Let me now move on to some reflections in order to lay the ground for a set of historiographical and methodological questions, followed by an invitation which might help us segue into the broader conversation. I must mention here that, and I communicated this to SherAli earlier too, that while reading the book, whenever I made note of a question to ask, it would be answered in the next paragraph or the next page. So it was quite a struggle to come up with smart-sounding stuff. So I want to prefix this section of my response with the rider that the text already answers in varied lengths the questions I'm going to pose here. But I reckon there is nevertheless some wisdom in asking them out loud and to hear from the expert himself. Also wanted to highlight the book even has a section for teachers with suggestions about which chapters to assign for which kinds of classes. That is to say that his attention to detail and preempting queries is very meticulous. Now, my first set of questions are part historiographical and part methodological, related to the fact that the stakes of intellectual thought of traditionalist Muslim scholars, the ulama, are not often seen at par with those of modernists or Muslim political leaders, for example. As much as one is critical of the politics of canonization, such historiographical choices arguably also indicate relevance in relation to major questions of their time, or an explicit conceptual engagement with hegemonic categories of social and political thought. Thinking further, like with the modernists, those scholars or leaders or thinkers examined under the rubric of political Islam, the Islamists, also become more important politically as well as historiographically speaking, because they engage head-on with questions of modern state, sovereignty, rights, so on, whether in registers of colonial or pre-colonial knowledge systems or a combination thereof. Yeah? Now, of course, there is merit in studying all kinds of writings which are produced, but how much are intra-Muslim scholarly debates among lesser canonized ulama actually relevant to examine the conditions and questions arising out of modern encounter? My concern here comes from my own work in thinking with the intellectual history of Islamic movements in Kashmir, which in fact are a further step away from the discussions on modern South Asian Islam and the kind of figures that you study. So how much do our critical readings impose intents and meanings upon the traditionalist ulama, especially when we articulate their thought in broader academic and disciplinary registers, which are often attempts at translation, as well as some sort of systemization for a very different audience in a very different time than the works were intended for. Related to such an inquiry is the very significant question of reception. How does one systematize evidence for the social importance of many of the debates taking place between the ulama? How does one respond to the argument which modernist Islamists or academics make that such debates and nuances at the end of the day are trivial and socially less relevant? Are people really that invested in listening to the ulama? And I myself would argue they are, but you wrote the book, so it would be nice to hear from you. Finally, let me end with an invitation for SherAli to speak to a broader set of concerns, which is about the importance of understanding complex theological encounters among Muslim intellectuals across pre-modern and modern periods as having a bearing on contemporary political realities. In various chapters, and as well as in the epilogue, you go into examples of challenges that non-Muslim and Muslim minorities in contemporary South Asia, in Pakistan and India in particular. Certainly, we are past the context of imperial sovereignties, even as that curriculum continues to exist in discursive forms as well as in varied activist political imaginaries, alongside attempts to continue to seek sovereignty and difference in everyday ritual practices. When we engage in academic studies, obviously we employ religious identities as hermeneutical categories to narrate and explain multiple genealogies of thought, and not to refight them, such categories, as you note in the book at various moments. However, how do we contend with doing so when contemporary violent forms of majoritarian politics impose upon us precisely the erasure of minoritized identities altogether, and with them the ways of thinking about, writing, narrating their social, political, or intellectual histories? I'll end here. Thank you for your patience.
Yes, please, yes.
Thank you so much to both Supriya and Suvaid. And I will be brief because the questions are so clear and the comments are elucidated so fantastically well that I should be able to address them specifically and pointedly. First, Supriya's comments. Supriya, as I was hearing your comments and writing all these notes, I just kept thinking how I wish Columbia had sent this to you as a reviewer, and you were one of the three who had reviewed, and I would be able to bring all these things into the book. This is really fantastic. And all that you've said, I am in resounding agreement with what you're saying here. And in some ways, I think you were providing a certain kind of an enrichment to this concept of an imperial Muslim political sovereignty, or imperial Muslim political theology, which in this case does work in a very specific register in relation to a very specific group of actors and scholars in relation to a very specific issue to do with the boundaries of religious identity in relation to the other. This category of this idea of after empire, basically something that came to my mind as one is reading different genres of texts by these Muslim traditionalist scholars, the ulama, oftentimes their use of these categories, like, for example, the abode of Islam, Darul Islam, a place governed by non-Muslim rule, Darul Harb, etc., or the idea of non-Muslim under Muslim protection, Dhimmi. The usage and the ways in which these ideas oftentimes travel in fatwas, legal opinions, reformist tracts, etc., it's quite interesting that oftentimes there is almost as if a given assumption of a grammar and a discursive network which is seen as self-evident, which is seen as having a certain kind of normative weight and legitimacy, even though the political context in which these scholars are operating, increasingly from the late 18th century onwards, is one which is not of the political context from which these categories come from. Primarily the context of the Abbasid empire and the formations of these Islamic legal schools. And in this case, after empire, actually, I'm referring to two different things which are connected but also distinct. One is, of course, the end of Muslim Mughal sovereignty and specific context of South Asia, but more broadly, the whole interpretive canvas of law and ethics, which is informed in the pre-modern tradition. And of course, this tradition is extremely diverse in terms of logics of caliphal sovereignty, logics within a specific legal school on very minute questions, even within Hanafi law. So I'm not trying to posit some kind of a pre-modern monolith, but rather there is nonetheless a foundational assumption of operating either in a context of Muslim imperial sovereignty or in a context whereby aspiring to resuscitating Muslim sovereign power is seen as a foundational purpose of law. So when that context is no longer there politically or in terms of its larger kind of political context, how does one deal with these categories and concepts? But you're absolutely correct in that this category can be widened into other spheres of logics of governance when it comes to Mughal kingship. And I really, really appreciated your comment about the larger kind of philosophical assumptions and projects that might have informed a 10th century thinker like Al-Amiri and that text of his. And I think your points that you're bringing here are adding to the expansion of the scope of this category in multiple knowledge traditions, registers, and what you're trying to argue and show, and very, I think, usefully and convincingly so, is that there is a larger life to the idea of an imperial sovereignty beyond the dictates of law and these, very specific arguments. So yes, my use is perhaps more specific, and by considering the kinds of other genealogies and other sort of underpinnings of the questions of sovereignty would only enrich this category. So I'm really, really thankful for that intervention. In terms of the second question about how do the ulama become a group, I think that's a very fascinating question, and that is absolutely correct. And that even not only in the 18th or 17th century, but even in the early 19th century, intra-Muslim debates, oftentimes very ferocious, on very sensitive and controversial questions, like, for example, things that I talked about in my first book, Defending Muhammad and Modernity. Can God lie? Can God create a second Prophet Muhammad? All these kinds of questions, which were debated with a lot of intensity, still were debated by individual Muslim scholars. We did not have really this concept of competing Muslim reform movements or groups, or this category which really becomes prominent by the late 19th century, this whole idea of what is called maslak, coming from the Arabic word suluk, or proper conduct and practice. But in the South Asian context, this word maslak and the plural masalik takes on a much more comparative meaning as reform movements that are in competition with each other. So I think clearly what we see here is a concurrent phenomenon whereby as British colonial sovereignty becomes more and more encrusted and takes more and more root, we see these intra-Muslim debates that before this were primarily fought out by individual Muslim scholars take on a much more group-centered orientation. And the interesting thing there is that the kind of logics of otherness are also quite varied. So, in my first book, when I looked at this debate between these two groups of Muslim scholars called the Barelvis and Deobandis, the interesting thing is that on so many of the things they have in common. They're from the same legal school. They're from both, have Sufi lineages. Both are in the same geography of northern India, Bareli and Deoband, even the same, contemporary state of Uttar Pradesh. But still, this was perhaps the most ferocious intra-Muslim polemic, the idea being that as proximate as the internal other is, the more competitive that becomes. But just the plethora of movements that we see here on the traditionalist side, Muslim modernists like the Aligarh Muslim University and movement. And clearly what is at work here is that all these Muslim groups have some kind of a recipe for how to diagnose the problem and the causes for the loss of Muslim political power, and then different kinds of recipes to engage that new reality. And in this case also, one of the things that I'm trying to argue is that debates on the limits of Hindu-Muslim friendship becomes one of the primary arenas where the fault lines within the Muslim tradition, especially those separating the Muslim traditionalists and the modernists, becomes highlighted and takes shape in the conjuncture, in the context of that moment of intra-Muslim debate, which we see perhaps most dramatically in relation to the debates between Sayyid Ahmad Khan and then his ulama rivals of different sorts. To answer your question, I think there is a certain sense in which the solidification of British colonial rule has a concurrent process of the reification and the group-centeredness of intra-Muslim debates and their logics of what constitutes the internal other, and also which sees a certain kind of a process of intensification even in other traditions. I mean, for example, this also is the moment for the formation of Arya Samaj, Singh Sabha. So clearly this is a larger development, but sees particular kinds of intensity with Muslim reform movements. And in terms of the last question about the final sentence of the book, so, the book ends with contemporary India and contemporary Pakistan. And I think the last sentence perhaps is even more relevant to contemporary Pakistan and perhaps other also contexts of Muslim majority nation states, that these categories, the Darul Islam, Darul Harb, protected non-Muslim dhimmi and so on, they can be used in very problematic ways, especially when they're articulated through the majoritarian instruments of the modern state. And one of the classic examples of that, and one of the most problematic examples of that, is of course the otherization of Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan. So interestingly, when these debates were happening in the 1970s, the whole process that led to the otherization of Ahmadi Muslims, you had people like this famous Deoband scholar, very authoritative scholar, Yusuf Benori, who basically, in heralding this movement, he in fact mentions that it's great that this problem has been resolved, and he says that at this point now, the Ahmadis have become modern-day dhimmis, and he's basically using the same category that comes from a very different kind of political context in a very different set of conditions. Or, for example, the context that I talk about in the epilogue of the book. A few years ago, there was this whole controversy around building a Hindu temple in Islamabad, the country's capital. So one of the main objections that came to that whole idea, the main objection was that a Muslim state, a state defined as Islamic, cannot be the main sponsor, the main patron for the building of a place of worship connected to a polytheistic religious tradition, a non-Muslim polytheistic religious tradition. And the other main problem was that an argument that was presented by different circles, that since Islamabad is the capital of an Islamic state of Pakistan, it is analogous to the garrison towns in early Islam like Kufa, Basra, etc., where constructing synagogues and churches were prohibited by scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, others, and so on. So basically, Islamabad is the contemporary garrison town, the Amsar of the contemporary moment. So this clearly, is a fascinating kind of a interpretive move, but can lead to some very problematic results and outcomes. So that's the first part of that sentence. That I think the this inheritance of these categories, as much as I'm invested in listening closely to these logics and the kind of interpretive paradigms that they articulate, but the seamless and pathological inheritance of these categories can do a lot of violence of some astounding proportions. But at the same time, one cannot leave the problem of religious difference, and one cannot surrender the problem of interreligious relations and the problem of religious minorities to the arbitrating authority of the modern state either, because it is the modern state and its mechanisms of regulating religion in a fashion that only exacerbate the minoritization of the minority that is at the heart of the contemporary violence as well. And there, of course, I'm most indebted to Sabah Mahmood and her work on precisely this question of ways in which modern state sovereignty and political secularism further exacerbates rather than better the plight of religious minorities. So what might be an outcome beyond these two, I'm not sure. And that would be a bit ambitious of a proposition to try to sketch out. But clearly, I think if one begins with a departure point of not engaging in a seamless inheritance of these pre-modern categories, so much embedded in a certain kind of imperial Muslim political theology, while also not surrendering this problem to the modern state, that might open up some kinds of avenues that are not based on some kind of left or right politics, that are based on an eager reading of the tradition, especially if actors you might disagree with, especially actors who might seem to be illiberal and not amenable to contemporary notions of pluralism. And this connects to the contemporary Indian context that I can talk more, and I will talk more in relation to Suvaid's questions. But that if you really want to be serious about confronting Islamophobia in the current context, you have to take seriously these logics of life and take seriously the sophistication and the complexity of these logics of law and life that are not amenable to contemporary notions of pluralism, interreligious harmony, and so on, to think about their ambiguities. I'm not talking about romanticizing them or glorifying either, but to take them seriously on their own terms, because ultimately to critique a logic of life, one needs to have a grounding and literacy in the workings of that logic. So that's basically what is a thought experiment with which I sort of ended the book. It seemed to me not appropriate to not make any, so that's the only kind of quote-unquote normative statement in the book, the very final sentence. But I'm unsure about what kind of a politics that might generate, but I do think that these two measures are important, the inheritance of pre-modern imperial political theologies and the sovereignty of the modern state. Coming to Suvaid's comments, so Suvaid, I will start with your final two questions and I'll just bring them together and perhaps do it as briefly as possible. You talked about the social importance of such debates and the contemporary relevance of these debates and ways in which these categories of the modernist and traditionalists operate in ways which are perhaps not in terms of a binary and so on. So the social importance and the contemporary relevance of this debate. I think for that, perhaps again, the epilogue and the case in the example with which I end the book in India is quite relevant. So in the epilogue, I primarily deal with this contemporary sort of charismatic figure who is in prison right now, Sharjeel Imam, who's pursuing his PhD at JNU, and after the promulgation of the CAA and NRC, gave a couple of speeches which were seen as controversial. One of them at, in fact, Aligarh Muslim University, in which he called for a strike, a chakka jam of traffic coming from Assam, and on that was charged with sedition, and he still is in prison under a trial which has widely been condemned for its Islamophobia. So he gives a speech, and towards the end of the speech, which is around an hour long, he in fact talks about this very case study that I talked about today. And he talks about Ahmad Raza Khan and this text of his, the finest viewpoint on cow sacrifice. And he raises the question, he does a couple of things. He basically argues that someone like Abul Kalam Azad might have had good intentions in what he was trying to do, but he makes a provocative argument that it's precisely scholars like Abul Kalam Azad and his Khilafat movement colleagues who made possible the contemporary burgeoning of Hindu nationalist violence when it comes to the cow question. That this was the beginning of forcing Indian Muslims to seize a ritual of significance to them, and that basically has opened the avenues for that kind of a majoritarian expectation of the religious minority to seize its own ritual practices. And then he makes the argument and makes the point that, why is it that when it comes to our curriculum, when it comes to our nationalist histories, especially when it comes to Indian Muslims, that this other perspective of someone like Ahmad Raza Khan is not really that widely known, is not that well available when it comes to curriculum and so on. And he makes the argument that, he says that I'm not in full agreement with Ahmad Raza Khan, but his main argument was that the question here is not whether cow sacrifice is obligatory or not, but the question is, can you seize it under the pressure of the majority community? And on this, he's very sympathetic with someone like Ahmad Raza Khan. And then he says, iconically in the speech, that our history has not been written. It will take 50 years to write our history. So clearly, someone like Sharjeel Imam, a person who is at the center of trying to wrestle with and confront a majoritarian state violence, is making an argument, and for him, this figure from 100 years ago is very attractive to his own politics. So it shows not only the relevance of these issues and these questions of ethics for a contemporary actor like Sharjeel Imam, but the other question that he's raising here is that if you really want to take seriously the politics associated with the minority community like Indian Muslims, you have to take seriously figures like Ahmad Raza Khan, who are not always very, palatable or amenable to a notion of pluralism that might come from a certain kind of a liberal secular genealogy. So I think just to take that argument seriously is I think, important. And the final thing I would say in relation to your comments, Suvaid, is that you talked about politics beyond the state. And that's absolutely the larger impetus for this work, to think about the idea of the political and to think about the idea of sovereign power that goes beyond the instruments of electoral democracy, that goes beyond the state, but to think about ways in which the regulation of the body in the public sphere, regulating the choreography of Muslim ritual life and distinction, becomes an arena for the expression of a certain kind of politics, a certain kind of the political. That, interestingly, is not tied to the territoriality or the institutions or the machineries and machinations of the modern state, but rather is concerned with the regulation and the choreography of a certain kind of an Indian Muslim individual and moral public in relation to these everyday practices. And I also want to clarify that in relation to this argument about Indian Muslim distinction in ritual life becoming a major site of Muslim sovereign power, notions of dominance and distinction, is not an idea which is shared by all Muslim scholars. In fact, even in the examples that I've shown here, for scholars attached to the Khilafat movement, the recipe for confronting this new moment of being a colonized minority was to resurrect these other kinds of institutions like the caliphate rather than rituals of distinction. In fact, Abul Kalam Azad went to the extent of even saying that even the obligations of religion like praying, fasting, etc. would have no normative meaning or legitimacy in the absence of the caliphate. Similarly, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, for him, confronting this moment meant being more confidently on the ladder of civilizational progress in his journal Tahzeeb ul-Akhlaq. So all of them have different recipes, but this kind of an argument does lead to a very consequential intra-Muslim debate on the boundaries of interreligious friendship that becomes one of the major arenas for the fault lines of these different instantiations of Islam in modern South Asia, the afterlives of which we live with even today in India, in Pakistan, and in fact in diaspora communities around the world. So thank you so much for the very rich engagement.
Okay, so thank you very much for the fantastic comments and also your response. So I'm actually going to do something that I should not do, which is to abuse my power here and ask you the first question. The whole time you were talking about this and the question of sovereignty and embodiment, ritual, etc., and the question of interpersonal boundaries, relative power with respect to interpersonal relations, the thing that kept being in my mind is slavery, which is completely illegal in Islamic law. How do these people deal with slavery? Is that, if compare, in parallel with the cow thing, is it obligatory as a Muslim marker then to actually enslave? And it's directly connected to the question of the non-Muslim, to race, to caste, all of those things. So I'm just actually really, really curious how that fits into these discussions.
Well, that's what a fascinating question. This is something I've not looked at, but I know Jonathan Brown in his book on slavery does have a section on South Asian Muslim scholars and their engagement with it. And if I remember it correctly, it's been a couple of years since I read him and then interviewed for my podcast. But he does show variations when it comes to this question and different ways of engaging with the pre-modern past. So you're absolutely right that this is an issue which was of normative significance. But what I will do is, in fact, probe further and think about ways in which it can be connected to this question. That it's a fascinating problem and question that I haven't read into, so I would rather not make up things right now.